you, Charlie, and what a lovely audience. They get a round of applause before things have actually begun. I usually think you need to earn it. So at the end, let's come back to whether or not we should applaud. Indeed, a warm welcome from me as well to Guesses, Errors, and Economics, which I must say must be one of the cleverest titles since Lies, Damn Lies, and Statistics. So across the Western world, sharply rising prices, static or declining salaries, and a decade of low growth have pushed the economy to the top of the political agenda. Pundits and politicians on all sides claim to have the answers, while governments and bankers put forward precise predictions for the economy. But is this an illusion? Predictions are frequently wildly wrong. Central banks and governments fail to predict inflation, while a recent IMF, International Monetary Fund study showed that out of the last 150 recessions, economists failed to predict 148. Should we conclude that we don't understand the economy and see economic predictions as random guesswork? Do we need a new economic theory that moves beyond Keynesian demand management, supply-side reform, and tight monetary control? Or is the very idea of a mathematically precise economic theory a pipe dream? Or can we jettison the pretension of precision while seeing our current broad brush framework are essentially right, and a powerful insight into the economy? So, on to our speakers who will be debating those questions. Joining us on Zoom is Gillian Tett from New York. She's an award-winning author, journalist, and U.S. editor-at-large at the Financial Times. She has been named Columnist of the Year, Journalist of the Year, and Business Journalist of the Year. Guy standing to my left is Professor of Development Studies at SOAS and co-founder of the Basic Income Earth Network. His recent work has focused on the dangers of globalization and the increasing need for unconditional basic income. And to my right, one of the leading figures in banking, Richard Werner, is a German economist, best-selling author, and university professor at the University of Winchester, with 2 decades of experience in the financial sector. A warm welcome to the panel. You really are a lovely audience. So the running order, I think those of you who are familiar with the festival know roughly the running order. For those of you who are new, thank you very much for coming to an economics one if this is your first. After all, economics has been defined as the science of telling you things you've known your whole life, but in a language that you can't understand. So, the running order, just as a refresher, each speaker will have 3 minutes to present their thoughts in turn on the opening question, and then we'll have a debate, and then there'll be your chance to pepper them with questions during the Q&A. So the pitches, where they'll have 3 minutes to set out their position, is this. Are government and central bank failures to correctly predict the economy evidence that we don't really understand the economy at all? Gillian Tett.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and it's a huge honour to be here, not least because I'm hovering over your head in my quad, so that gives me an immediate advantage. But I have one key idea I want to share, which is that what has gone wrong with economics is that economists have sometimes thought that all their models and clever tools are like a GPS system, not like a compass.
Yeah, I have faced a life of being an economist, and I did my PhD in Cambridge in the 1970s. And you're listening to a man who spent most of his career excommunicated. Because at the time I was being taught by some of the greatest economists in history, there was an economics revolution taking place. And a group of economists that we used to read as a way of getting the discussion going because we thought they were so stupid, took over the world by the end of the 1970s. It was the Mont Pelerin Society, which had been set up in 1947 by a group of renegade 36 economists on the far right. And for a long time, they were not taken seriously at all. But then, with their political representatives in Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and a few others, suddenly they became the new orthodoxy. And in the ensuing period, they became hegemonic, such that when I was a student, you regarded a variety, a pluralism of economics, a different pedagogy, if you like, with different people coming with different assumptions, Ricardians, Marxians, institutionalists, neoclassical, so that there was a competing dialogue always enthralling all of us. But that disappeared in the 1980s with this hegemonic neoliberalism. And no fewer than 9 of the original 36 renegades went on to receive Nobel Prizes in economics. Okay? And that hegemony fed into the media, and it fed into the politics. And therefore, the mainstream, the orthodoxy that took over the media, that took over the political discourse, ignored all. And I resent the way this question is put, our predictions. You speak for yourself. Because there were quite a lot of us saying this model is doomed. And it's bred rentier capitalism, which I've discussed in this book, The Corruption of Capitalism, in which the voices of dissident economists just weren't given the time of day. Now, in the early 1990s, if I could give an example by way of conclusion, I happened to be director of operations high in the UN system in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. So I was working in Russia, working in Ukraine, and so on. And I was convinced that the economic policies being pushed by the economic orthodoxy were going to be catastrophic, and they were going to breed a kleptocracy, and they were going to lead to collapsing life expectancy and worse. It seemed to me obvious from my economics training. And I wrote a book, it was blocked. I wrote articles, made speeches, and I suddenly got an invitation from the US State Department to go across and address the State Department. And I was in front of a whole lot of CIA people talking about it. Now, I remember I wrote a piece for the Financial Times. The Financial Times printed it, but then printed underneath an orthodox economist poo-pooing it and saying, this is a lot of, don't have to take it serious. Same in the New York Times. Of course, subsequently, we know what's happened. And I actually predicted that the Ukraine crisis, which is on paper, I'm not saying it after the event, it's on paper, right? Eventually it was published and so on. Now, to me, we have a situation where that hegemonic situation is leading to the same voices, regardless of how many times they failed. Yesterday I saw Jim O'Neill, who was chief economist of Goldman Sachs before the financial crisis, okay? He predicted in big, bold terms that the whole world was going to be moving into a middle-class nirvana, okay? Now, if a person does that and then on his watch, the system collapses, why is he still being given the time of day? Why is he, yesterday, on the world news, there was Jim O'Neill. I said, what? The same with Jeffrey Sachs, who was pushing shock therapy in Eastern Europe. He's all the time being, these economist journalists are quoting them. But they won't go to the dissidents. They won't say mea culpa. Okay? I'm not just speaking for myself, I'm speaking for a whole lot of economists who were not listened to before the crisis came. So I don't think we should say economics in general. I think you must look at it from a political point of view, because it's a political economy issue. And that's where I would come into the debate. We need a more pluralistic economics. Thanks very much.
Richard Barnard.
Thank you very much. Well, Actually, I entirely agree with Guy, and I can build on it. It's also true that, I've had the same experience, that when you have an understanding of the economy and give predictions that come true, it doesn't mean that the mainstream media is going to report you and quote you, because there is an official narrative that has to be pushed. And the whole thing really started actually a bit earlier in the 19th century with the so-called classical economics, which is really more or less propaganda for Britain, its empire, and having just had the Industrial Revolution, needing to export to the world and needing to persuade other countries to open up to British exports. And that's how the whole, some call it the Ricardian vice, this approach in economics was devised, where you have axioms, which are things that you proclaim to be true, and we never have to check because we know them to be true. Now, if you did check, you'd find they're not true. And then you add assumptions that you admit are not true, but what the heck, let's just, for sake of argument, have this model. This is called the deductive or hypothetico-axiomatic approach. And no science uses that because it's not scientific. But the case had been made in economics, that's the approach we have to use. So I've introduced the inductive approach in economics, and I thought, there's no good reason why we can't use the scientific research methodology also in economics. And of course, it'd be common sense to anyone who hasn't studied economics, but I tell you, that's heresy in economics, where you, just like a scientist in physics and chemistry, you look at the data, at the facts, and then based on those, that's how you formulate a hypothesis, you test it, that's how you formulate a theory, that's how you get results. But that gets suppressed. And you will be suppressed. And I've had my State Department visit also in Tokyo, CIA. If you talk too much about the things that matter, which you're supposed to leave out of economics. I mean, any of you, if I ask you, so what do you think is important in the economy? I'm sure the majority will say money, and maybe banks. And that is true, but these are the two things that economists have been trained to drop out of economics, and they're not an economic model. So when the 2008 crisis happened, and there was a banking crisis, the honest answer of the professors of economics at the leading universities would have been, sorry, I can't comment. Well, why not? Well, banks are not in my model. I mean, I regard them irrelevant. They have no impact. And that has been the state of the art. And all the central banks have been pushing this false, fake economics, literally, financially sponsoring it and sponsoring the academics. And they use these models called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, DSG models, which are very clever, complicated things, but have nothing to do with the planet we're on. Now very quickly, so what is the real economics? If you just use the scientific research methodology, you very quickly come to the answers and the truth is revealed. Oh, my microphone gets cut off. I'm quite used to that. Particularly now that I come to the main point. Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? Okay. So, by not assuming all these fancy things like perfect information, complete markets, perfect competition, infinite lives, which they need for their models, you find there is no equilibrium. In fact, there's never been any equilibrium in any market. Because the requirements for equilibrium are far too demanding. And then the reality is all markets are rationed. And in rationed markets, the short side principle applies, which means that whichever of the two quantities demand and supply is smaller determines the outcome, and the short side is power. Now apply this to money. The demand for money is always larger because money is pretty useful. So the short side is the supply. Whoever supplies the money has power. And it's obvious. Pick and choose to decide who gets money for what purpose and how much, and that will reshape the economic landscape. So where does money come from? Well, I had to publish a book with that title because the economists had not explained it, and they didn't know where money comes from. It's created by banks out of nothing through credit creation, and that is driving the economy. So in May 2020, using my analysis of bank credit creation, I warned publicly that we're likely to have significant inflation in 18 months' time. And I tell you, I was forecasting that by analyzing central banks and what they were doing and their impact on bank credit creation. I did not predict a war in Ukraine or an energy supply shock, because that is not the reason why we have the inflation. It was 100% central bank credit creation, and the central banks inside, there's two groups. There's a small group of those who know how it works, and there's those, and their central bankers have told me this many times, oh, this is our hired economists. You know, they have to use these false models, and they produce the official stuff. We use that for information management. And of course, as Guy was saying, the journalist profession has become very much usurped by that, and they follow where the central banks are guiding them. So the inflation was created by central banks. They're in the business of creating boom and bust cycles. But we can have, just one more point, we can have high, sustainable, equitable growth without inflation for decades. But that's not allowed. Some countries did it: Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China under Deng Xiaoping. And China, they lifted more people out of poverty than anywhere else in history by using bank credit creation only for productive purposes, not for consumption that creates inflation, and not for asset transactions that creates asset boom bust cycles and banking crisis. It's actually very simple, but we need to address the facts and get scientific economics based on facts, not this ideological propaganda. Thank you.
Thank you. The 3 minutes allotted to each speaker.
That was 3
We
minutes.
are a bit over time. We've got less than 10 minutes to go through the rest, the next two topics. But I think they address the first theme. We do three themes, basically. So Q&A starts at 2 o'clock. But I think it was a really a stimulating set of opening remarks. It essentially answered the first topic, which is our inability to predict the economy a wider error in our approach to economics? I'm going to say yes for the whole panel. So I'm going to move on to the second question, which is, what do we do about it? Do we need a new economic theory? And if so, what is it? So let me come to Guy on this first.
Well, I don't think is my microphone working? Yeah. I don't think we need so much as a new economic theory. We need a political economy approach. And to follow up from what Richard has just said, he may know this statement. Andrew Bailey, the governor of the Bank of England, he candidly stated that with quantitative easing, which is what the Bank of England has been doing in the 2008 period and in response to COVID, he candidly said, we don't know how it works in theory, but it seems to work in practice. So the question that any critical person like myself would immediately ask, work for who? Okay? And the secret, if you want to watch what happens with economics, if you're a non-economist, is very simple. Okay? Just think, what is the interest of Goldman Sachs? What policy would Goldman Sachs like to come? Because then you will get pretty close to being able to predict what will happen. Because what's been happening is that more and more and more politicians, central bank governors, people in influential positions, people owning the media, have spent years working in Goldman Sachs. Rishi Sunak got his apprenticeship, 4 years training from Goldman Sachs in California, and then he became a hedge fund manager for Goldman Sachs, in a tax haven for Goldman Sachs. And then he becomes chancellor, and he appoints his old boss from Goldman Sachs as the chief economic advisor in Downing Street. It goes on and on and on, okay? Central bank governor, Goldman Sachs pass, and they go back. So in a sense, finance has become the tail that's wagging the economic dog.
Okay, thank you. Can I come to you, Richard? What you outlined in terms of the inability to include banking within macro models, I think that has now become, as you would expect since the financial crisis, the micro foundations of macro models. Can you just outline a bit more about where you would like to see a new economic model or new economic approach take shape? Maybe then help us, predict a few things like inflation?
Well, as I said, I mean, the approach should be scientific, and that means data-driven, evidence-driven. But the truth, as you know, evidenced by the data, usually clashes with power in almost every discipline, actually, as we found recently in the health area, or others encounter it in engineering or physics, because powerful institutions want to maintain that power and influence, and the truth may be, you know, getting in the way. And the scientific approach means you don't work by making assumptions, but actually checking the data and developing your entire approach based on the empirical observation. Now, all the data are from the past, and that's why we need to analyze history, and that includes institutions, that includes the history of human behavior, so obviously also from an anthropological perspective, sociology, all the social sciences that look at the facts, which economists, in fact, as Guy correctly put it, this would used to be an extremist group of fringe economists, but who came to dominate economics, and they still do dominate economics everywhere. What they did, namely ignore all the facts, including the facts, the empirical facts from psychology, sociology, anthropology, and just ignore it, and they built their theoretical models because they were being sponsored, literally, by those who benefit from this. And that has been the central planners. And this, you know, is well documented how the central banks have usurped all the leading journals in economics and finance, and they're sponsoring essentially this theoretical and false economics. And if you don't publish in these journals, you won't get a professorship, and this is how the whole discipline gets controlled. Now, as a result, a lot of fake stories are still out there, and a central one is about interest rates. And just to give you an example, this is actually the one area where all the theories for the last 200 years seem to have agreed on, that if you lower interest rates, you get higher growth, and if you raise interest rates, that will slow the economy. And don't we hear it all the time? Like now, this is the discussion with interest rate rises. Well, it's hard to believe, but while this has been said for 200 years, from classical, neoclassical Keynesian to monetarism to new classical present-day economics, there's no empirical evidence for this. There isn't. So I did the first empirical tests of this, and the answer is, oh, it's wrong. Actually, it's wrong in two dimensions. The correlation between interest rates and growth is not negative but positive. They always move together in the same direction. And the causation, statistical causation, runs from growth to interest rates, so they follow. Because both are driven by a third variable. And what is that? You can already answer that question if you'd listen to me. It's the quantity of bank credit. That's the money creation in the system. And if you create more, there will be more transactions. If it's more for GDP transactions, you get more GDP growth, and that pushes up interest rates after a lag. So the central planners have been using this, the interest rate smokescreen, to hide their true actions. For 20 years, the Bank of Japan was pretending, oh, we're trying to create a recovery. We're lowering rates, look, because rates is the key tool. When the central bankers privately told me, actually, we know this is not going to work, but we want to prolong the recession, but we can't say this publicly. And actually, they were reducing the quantity of credit for 2 decades, big recession in Japan. And that's the game they've been playing, boom and bust cycles. The Bank of England is very good at that. And where's this heading? Well, it's heading towards ever greater concentration of power. And we see this particularly in the banking system, because the way to avoid boom-bust cycles and to have high growth with no inflation and with lots of job creation and everyone benefiting from this is when banks lend to small firms for productive business investment. Because bank lending is money creation. Banks, by lending, they don't use existing money. They actually are allowed to create new money through the loan. So when you get a bank loan, that money in your account is newly created by the bank, and obviously that will have an impact. If it's done when there's a productive idea, to increase productivity, add value somehow in the economy, then you get growth, job creation, and no inflation. And that's what in the high growth East Asian economic miracle they managed to do, guiding bank credit for those purposes. But when it's used for consumption, like in March 2020, massive inflation follows. When it's used for asset purchases, which the majority of British bank lending is for asset purchases, you get asset inflation. But so to get this, without more centralization, we need to change the structure of the banking system and create small banks, community banks, because they're the only banks that lend to small firms, which is one of the projects I hope we can talk about a bit more. I've been working on, because they're money creators, and there should be a bank in your community, at least one, if not several, lending to entrepreneurs locally, to small firms, because it's money creation, which is a public good, and that should be locally controlled. If it's centrally controlled, it'll be out of control. It's too powerful and unaccountable. We need to decentralize power by having community banks, which then give local people the power over the most important economic tool.
Thank you. We have just a few minutes left for the last topic, but I'm not going to summarize that round. Just that an economist joke comes to mind, which is, and this echoes something that Guy said, which is an economist looks at something that works in practice and goes, it doesn't work in theory. But actually, it was all really interesting. I think fleshing out these alternatives really was worth taking, the time. I'm sorry, I'm trying to stick to a schedule. Make sure you have your time for Q&A. There is one last topic, just hearkening back to those of you who were wondering if we're ever going to be able to make an accurate prediction. The last bit of the debate is actually just going to ask that question, which is, and I'm going to ask each of you to answer it rather concisely, if I may, which is, will we one day, and it doesn't have to be we in the royal sense, it could be any subset of we, be able to make accurate economic predictions? Or is economic precision just a fantasy? Richard?
It's not a fantasy. If you look at my forecasts, they've been pretty accurate for the last 35 years. Last time I sat together with Gillian Tett in Tokyo in 1997, I think, if she remembers what I said, I think it panned out pretty neatly, that Japan won't recover until bank credit creation recovers, which was only 2013-14. The problem is in the banking system and so on. I proposed a new monetary policy in 95, which I called quantitative easing, which is a quick way of getting out, but they refused to adopt it and then distorted it to prolong the recession and had this false QE. So really, it's possible, yes, is the answer. But of course, the powers that be may not want it because they have different agendas, and that's what we always have to keep in mind. What is the actual goal here?
Thank you. Guy, do you agree with that? Is it ever possible?
No, I don't. And I'm drawing these comments on a book by Nassim Taleb called The Black Swans, 2 books, and a book, Anti-Fragility. And basically his thesis, with which I agree, is that we have to learn to live with uncertainty. We are not faced with an industrial society situation where you can predict the risks and then develop insurance systems so that gives people that. We're in a situation of globalization, an era of pandemics, global warming, where shocks can hit all of us at any stage. We're all vulnerable, okay? And if in those circumstances you recognize that obvious, I find it a fairly obvious fact, if you like, then you have to develop systems that deal with people's fragility, to give them a sense of resilience, both at individual level and at society level and at economic level. It's one of the reasons why I support a basic income, because then you get people saying, yeah, I'm going to be able to handle a shock if it hits me, unless it's totally catastrophic, but at least within a range. So I think we've got to learn to live with uncertainty.
Let me just bring Richard back to comment on that, because completely diametrically opposed to
Yes,
you.
Yeah.
So Richard, you want to come back with me?
Well, on 2 levels. So I do think it's possible because they just haven't tried, and if you work empirically, it's not so hard. Quantity of credit creation disaggregated into bank credit for the real economy, for GDP, will tell you what GDP is going to do, and then for asset transactions will tell you what asset markets are going to do. So it's possible. but and also the conclusion is interesting. You come to the conclusion we need a basic income, and of course I sympathize with this idea, which is an old idea, a century old. But why has it been favored since, well, the last, 10 years by all the billionaires, the Davos billionaire class? Why are they favoring it? Because they want to roll out centralization, digital ID, and digital money and CBDCs. And if you link that, it becomes a very totalitarian system. So you have to ensure that we don't have so much centralization.
Okay.
And the basic income is going to be the bribe to accept the microchip implant, I fear.
Thank you. Okay, so Ryan, you got to come back on this one.
No, I mean, I think that, excuse me, that's ridiculous. Because one of the things that when people have resilience, they become stronger about demanding other things. Okay? We need people to feel less fearful. That's the economic issue of our time. And less vulnerable. So I think the reality is, there's a famous term invented by a disgusting man, Rumsfeld, unknown unknowns. And we are facing a future of unknown unknown. We've already had 6 pandemics this century. And we don't know when the next one's going to hit. We don't know when the next... There have been 500 financial shocks since the beginning of the 1980s. We don't know when the next one will come. And I've defined all the neoliberal economists have failed. I would have liked to see IMF economists in that 148, because the IMF report said IMF economists, not economists altogether. But I think we need to think out of the box for transforming. And then the last comment I would like to make, if I may, which is that one of the sins of this hegemonic system comes from what's called the Austrian School of Economics, which formed the background of the Monte Pelerin Society and Thatcherism and so on. And one of their tenets was the following. It says, anything that doesn't have a price has no value. Now that meant that automatically if you privatize something, that increases economic growth. And it's infantile for politicians to be saying growth, growth, growth. But for me as a student, we would have thought this was mad. Distribution matters. Distribution matters.
Thank you, Guy. Richard, why don't you take the first one and the third one?
All right, thank you very much. So you said that, yes, I mentioned the need to decentralize banking. And so your question essentially is, doesn't this also create risk, or aren't there risks in small banks, regional banks, Silicon Valley Bank in America, fears about the regional banks? Well, actually, as long as banks create credit for productive business investment, they're actually quite sound. And there's never been a banking crisis when banks do that. What happened at Silicon Valley Bank is very unusual. It's pretty much, it started with people withdrawing around 9 billion of deposits in 22. The bank management didn't respond to how any bank manager would respond by raising interest rates and gathering deposits. No, they took losses on their nominal losses on their bond portfolio and turned them into real losses. Very unusual, very strange. And then they said, let's issue more equity, which means you get subjected to the primary equity market analysts who will conclude, well, this bank just made huge losses, and so then the equity issue failed. So these are serious management mistakes. And then Silicon Valley investor Peter Thiel, on one day, 12th of March, Thursday, pulled out all his billions and all the investment companies that he'd invested in, he instructed to pull out, and he went public, pull out your money. And one more thing, Silicon Valley Bank had joined the pilot scheme of the FedNow settlement system. So he had no more control of the outflows, and in one day more than 40 billion left the bank. And where was the Fed? Where was the Fed in this? FedNow actually was helping get the money out. That when the Fed was created in 1913, Congress was very reluctant, and the main argument was, but if a bank is sound, you can still see it fail if there's a run, even unjustified, a panic by depositors. And that's true. And that was the argument for founding the Fed. The Fed didn't step in.
Sorry,
So it's pretty much a orchestrated takedown, because the central bankers want to reduce the number of banks. Under the ECB in Europe, 5,000 banks have already disappeared. Under the Fed in the last 30 years, almost 10,000. So they want to centralize, and CBDCs, of course, is going to get rid of all the banks. Yes, and there'll ultimately only be one bank left, like in the Soviet system, Gosbank, and that seems to be what they want, but we have to hold against that. So my main argument is, let's set up new, very soundly managed community banks. And that comes to the third point, David Fishwick. I myself have been doing the same thing. Hampshire Community Bank, something I've worked for 10 years to set it up. The regulators not exactly falling over themselves to encourage this, but if you want to set up a bank for the super rich, they got their banking license in 6 months. So there's clearly some resistance there, but it can be done. And Dave did great work. Every community should have one or two local community banks, and we should all demand this. And then I think attitudes will start to change if the regulators realize that actually people are demanding this, because it can be done very effectively. In Germany, the economy has been doing very well for 200 years, despite shocks and crises, because it has the largest number of small local banks. 80% of the banks are locally headquartered community banks that only lend in the local area. So the banker is always in the same boat as the local small firms. Then you get the right decisions. You don't get the nonsense and speculation.